when we talk about the Islamic economic system, I mean, one thing we need to keep in mind is that we cannot talk about it in a vacuum, right? We can talk about what money is in Islam and what it's not, but at the same time, without the core implementation of the system in itself, it's not going to lead us anywhere. So kind of going back to your question, so money, as Brother Malik already mentioned, that, gold and silver, money in Islam essentially is anything which has intrinsic value to it, let it be a commodity or any minerals whatsoever, right? So that's essentially what money in Islam is. Whereas in the current system, which is based on the fiat currency system, which is completely antithetical to the Islamic, the monetary, policy. But you can probably delve a little bit more into it and talk about the gold and silver standard, right? And how it kind of relates to the Islamic economic system overall, and how it's the evidences and everything else for it.
Yeah. So the evidence for that, which is interesting, is that, when it comes down to the normally, like in Islam, tools in general we can adopt from other kind of civilizations. So when it comes to, like internet technology or other kind of technologies, it comes down to is that we can adopt other technologies. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is when it came to the monetary system, is one of the few times that what we can see or we can like kind of point to where the tool was specified in a sense in the Sharia. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, for example, like he ordered using the weights of Makkah, the people of Makkah. And what is interesting is that from the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam right to the fall of the Khilafah, and even till today, which I believe it's 4.2 grams is a dinar.
It's a dinar, yeah.
Yeah.
So what to call, yeah.
Yeah. So it has been a consistent standard, and I was reading some related work on that, and that the Muslims by Allah's permission never cheated the standard. Right? Yeah. Whereas, for example, the Romans, I think they had originally had it for their gold coin, it had 8 grams, and they kept
debasing it. Yeah.
It kept debasing it. And what's interesting is that going back to this issue of hukum shari and the obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is that this is what kind of drives the Islamic society, right? And that's interesting that for 1400 years, when the Khilafah was still around, that even to the end of the days, it didn't cheat, even though it had economic situation. One of the things that led to the demise of the Ottomans was their inability to pay their debts. But they didn't cheat the standard, right? Which is interesting, is that even in our weakest of times, there still was this concept of taqwa.
That's interesting.
And that. So the other one evidence is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala condemns the prohibition of gold and silver and connects it to spending, right? Which points to that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to use as well as another evidence that this is the gold and silver standard, right? So then when we understand the hukam, we can see its brilliance, right? Yeah. Because when Allah directs our mind to the right under the right hukam and how to deal with the situation, it's one of the core things when we're trying to compare the capitalist economic system to the Islamic solutions, because that's what is, plaguing us today is capitalism. Communism is dead. Alhamdulillah.
So what do you brothers think? And I think, Brother Huram, you had shared this article with me where the Malaysian Prime Minister and I think the leaders of these other few...
Yeah, this was the Kuala Lumpur summit where the leaders of Turkey, Malaysia and Iran, they had attended. And one of the suggestions put forward by the Malaysian Prime Minister was maybe Muslims should consider trading... should consider barter trading as well as a gold and silver standard, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure how that works. What kind of barter system are they talking about? How will it work in the present context? And what's this gold and silver standard? Is it like we have foreign exchange reserves which are in dollars, so get rid of those dollars and then base it on gold and silver? Is that what it's talking about?
So I think we have to kind of separate two things. One is that when we look at these kind of rulers that are kind of exist, when they kind of come up with these solutions, is that they come up with a certain kind of political context, which is that they are coming from kind of point of view of where they play within the current system. Let's put it in a kindly, is that they play with within the UN, and when they destroyed the Ottoman state, the Khilafah state. And cut it up into the little pieces, and whether it's Turkey or Iran or these other kind of players, is that they're playing within that game, and and then we see that really the owner of those kind of situation is still the capitalist nations, right? So the recent assassination of the Iranian general, for example, it shows that as long as when he was doing what needed to be done according to the foreign powers, they were fine with what he was doing, but the moment he stepped out of the line, then he was finished, and we see that with other rulers as well, that that when if they get something when they don't do what they're supposed to do, then the mechanisms of the control comes out, right? And so the only way for something of this magnitude to come back would be where you'd need an independent political entity that was capable of withstanding the pressure from especially the U.S. to stand on its own two feet. Even when the U.S., for example, abandoned the gold standard in 1971 under Nixon, it had the political capability of doing so and imposing that. One of the American officials told the Europeans, it's our currency, but it's your problem. Meaning that because they have all the firepower in the world at that time, the Europeans just had to deal with the fiat standard. Because the economists, even both on the American and the European side, were quite worried because this is in previous kind of experiments, whether it was in France in the 18th century or in other places, the fiat standard didn't really work out because it's not intuitive, right? Like to have all this money, to kind of having essentially giving the U.S. Printing press the Midas touch. They can just kind of flood the money with the money through the world. And I think that's partly why it survived so long, because it's just kind of floating outside into the peripheries of the empire, if you will. So going back to what the way it would work, you can't implement Islam in piecemeal. You can't just take the gold standard and then still have riba, for example, interest as a standard way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala designed the system. Is to work in an ecosystem. All these laws have to work with each other, right? So you can't, for example, cut the hand of the thief if you don't have a policy that enables the fair distribution of wealth, right? So, people can see that injustice, that on the one hand, you're implementing essentially capitalism, but then at the same time, you're implementing the Islamic rules around that, and that, which actually forbids the cutting the hand of the thief in a famine, for example. So when you look at, if from a very practical perspective for the gold and silver standard comeback, none of the current Muslim countries would be able to kind of really put that forward in a way that was sincere, because if they were actually doing it in a sincere way, they would be quickly dealt with. And if we are serious about kind of making that a reality, then it has to have an independent political entity that kind of is able to kind of stand on its own 2 feet outside of the capitalist system.
Would it be fair to say that, like, for an initiative that, like, say, the leaders of Turkey and Malaysia, they're toying with this idea of only using barter and gold and silver, is like putting the cart before the horse? Is that a fair assessment to say? Because we can't just okay, we're going to do this, but we're not going to do the rest of the other I guess requirements that is best for a full functioning system, right? For humanity, right? So they can see the value in, bartering or using gold and silver because they have intrinsic value as opposed to using paper money, which has no value. I think this is the dilemma that most of the Muslim countries or people want to do good are in. Would that be a fair assessment?
You've got is essentially how do we get where we need to go, right? Where we rebuild Islam, rebuild the honor and dignity of the Ummah, and have the ability to defend ourselves as an Ummah. And you're right. Like it's a good way of putting it is that what is the objective ultimately of this political entity in our countries, right? If they're not there to defend us as people and to
what I've also noticed is like a lot of talk, no action. For example, as Brother Khurram, as you mentioned, based on that article where Malaysian Prime Minister says, let's do this, but they won't even do it. Like they talk a lot, but imagine if they did. Like for example, Turkey and Malaysia and what other countries were? Iran, yeah. And so they decided, they made a pact, Iran, Turkey, and Malaysia, that we're going to only deal with gold and silver. And as you mentioned, if they're just focusing on that aspect, the powers to be will come down really hard on them. That's something that's foreseeable. What do you brothers think?
Well, I think a lot of the U.S. hegemony is based on the dollar. Right?
Yeah.
Like when you look at it from a logical point of view, again, outside of Islam, like it's actually a beneficial system to the U.S. If they wouldn't be able to outsource all for example, their manufacturing to China, if they had to ship boatloads of gold and silver to China, because then China would acquire all the monetary, the medium of exchange physically, right? So it's advantageous for the U.S. to maintain the dollar standard, right? And this goes back to, again, the issue of taqwa, which is that the issue is that the reason why I implement these standards is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, right?
Yeah.
Even though like one could argue that this new political entity would benefit from that. So if these people were serious on trying to challenge that standard of the U.S., it's a pillar of the American imperial system, right? To have the dollar standard. So I can't see how they would tolerate that, or what game America was playing. If it was America was behind it, what game was it playing? So
I mean, yeah, and also, if anything, I mean, since the Iranian Revolution, they had almost 50 years now, almost, yeah, 70 and plus 20, yeah, 50 years,
40, yeah, 40,
yeah, 48ish, right? So to actually, implement the so-called like Islamic economic system. So and we kind of see where they're heading and what they've been up to for the past so many years now. So I think, going back to your point, I think it's just to relate to the general public sentiment, which is changing in the Muslim world right now, I believe so, to kind of pacify the so-called quote-unquote Islamist, that we are working to revive the so-called Islamic way of life, however they define it, as per their own definition. So I think that's more of kind of keeping the sentiment in check.